See how many people reply. Like, there's Don't know. I could probably just do this like this. But hello, welcome to Roulette. I'm Amanda. I'm the director of artistic planning at Roulette. And I am just making this really quick announcement to tell you a couple things. So this is a workshop that's part of our workshop series. We have had 3 so far. We are gonna take a break for the spring and summer, and then we'll probably have more in the fall. So if you're a Roulette member, you get to come to them all for free. And then the other part is that they're all on our website, so you can see all of them. We've done ones in January with Ellen Fullman. We did Siat Lombard in February, so you should all check them out. I wanna say this microphone is gonna be right here. I will be a mic jockey, so if you have questions, you should definitely use the mic. We're recording this and keeping it on YouTube forever, so we want to hear what your questions are. But I will introduce Wayne Horvitz over here. Great. Yeah, and he'll tell you a little bit about conduction in history and practice. Thanks so much.
That's a little better, isn't it? Hey, thanks for coming. I'd like to start by saying that my wife and my son and my daughter and I all totally hate going, hi Dave, totally hate going to the theater and being asked to participate as audience members. I mean, we will literally, if they ask for volunteers, we'll just leave. But, so, I'm going to start with just a little bit of conduction, and I just want to say the problem with those things is it puts people on the spot and they feel like they have to do something to be funny. This is not the case. We're just talking about structure here. We're not talking about anything that has to do with any content. So I just want you to do a very simple thing, which is to hum a long tone when I go like this, okay? Wait. First premise. Thank you. Oh, I'm so glad that happened because it just brings me right to what I want to talk about. One of the really interesting things about conduction is that, well, I shouldn't say interesting. One of the more powerful things about conduction when you're doing it is that you have the ability to actually make things happen in real time, just like you would as a composer. I mean, if you're a composer and you decide to have the basses do this for 8 measures and then have the trumpets come in, you know, that's obvious. And it's no more, you know, I think one of the things I want to stress tonight about conduction is that it is simply a technique to make music like many other techniques to make music. I don't believe in, personally, I don't have a thing about, you know, improvisation is everything and composing is bullshit, or composing is everything, and et cetera, et cetera. It is just a way to make music. When we get into Butch, we'll talk about how he's decided to make it sort of the epicenter of most of his latter part of his life. And when we talk about, my experience is not that at all. It's simply, sometimes I want to use pencil and paper, sometimes I want to use a drum machine, sometimes I want to use a computer, sometimes I want to do a completely improvised piece, sometimes I want to write a tune and have someone solo on it, sometimes I want to use conduction and everything in between. But the conduction works really well if people watch the person doing it and obey them. I was once, up for a job at the Cornish College of the Arts, and the guy who was on the committee asked me, what does a composer do? And I said, that's simple. A composer is somebody who tells other people what to do. And it's not much more than that. I mean, you essentially, when a string quartet plays your piece, they are saying, we are at your service. And it's the same with conduction up to a point. We'll talk about that, and a lot of content comes from the improvisers, but the important thing is that, well, no, one of the important things is that the person doing the conduction has at least a certain amount of say in the process, and it's mostly about structure and not so much about content, though that's not entirely true, and we'll get into that in a little bit. What I'd like you to do is I'm going to tell everyone to sing a long tone, but then I'm going to cue you. You can do a different pitch. Okay, now I'm going to do that really obnoxious thing everyone does. Come on, louder. Okay, here we go. Now let's say I do here, and I just say, you know, all of you, and if you're in the middle and you decide you want to, it doesn't matter. But the point is, mostly the people on this side, and we've got this. And don't stop when they go. Okay, now one of the nice things about this, so I was working with this high school recently, and I made this really important point. Nobody is going to say, oh, wow, isn't that amazing? I mean, conduction has to get amazing, just like writing a piece of music has to get amazing. I remember, I don't know, I was talking to someone years ago and someone said that they'd listened to a lot of certain kind of improvised music, and they said just a lot of it was so bad. And I was like, and you're telling me that, you know, every person who wrote a piece of classical music, I mean, a lot of it's so bad. And in pop music, a lot of it's so bad. Who cares about the bad stuff? I mean, we want to talk about the good stuff. So I'm working with this high school group, and I'm just saying to them, don't worry if it sounds good. You know, let's do this. And particularly with horns. Obviously, I use this a lot, and Butch used this a lot, particularly with people who sustain notes. You can use it with drummers, you can use it with bass players, but obviously it's very effective with horns. So I've got this line of high school saxophone players, about 12 of them, and I keep going like this, and I do it. I said, don't judge, let's just do it, just commit. And you know, so finally this chord came up, and I was, God, man, I wish I had a pencil so I could transcribe it, because it was just gorgeous. And I asked this young woman in the front row, as an alto player, I said, so what did you think of that chord? She said, I didn't like it very much. And so, you know, whatever. I mean, there's no accounting for taste in any kind of music, and so that's not really what's important here. I would like to say just a couple things up front, which is that in talking about my experience with conduction and in talking about my relationship to Butch and the history of Butch, you know, this is totally from my perspective. Most of the pictures I'm going to show you have me in them, et cetera, et cetera. It has nothing to do with Butch. I mean, that's just, I'm here. And also, I worked with Butch a lot in the late 70s through the late 80s, and then I didn't for many, many years. Finally, he came out to Cornish, and I arranged for him to do a conduction with both a student group and an adult group, and that was great. And then at the end of his life, we were in communication about a project he had. But so many people went on to work with him, generations of people. And Brandon Ross, who's the great guitar player here in town and plays with Butch a lot and played with Henry Threadgill and others, and will be here tomorrow night on stage. He came out to Seattle this fall to do a thing I put together about conduction. And he was saying to people, you know, Butch made everyone feel like you were his best friend. And that's absolutely true. He was charismatic, he was charming and all those things. And that's all I'm gonna say about that, but it was, you know, very strong, very beautiful, and very powerful. So this is just going to be totally from my perspective. I'm sure there's all sorts of people I won't mention, and I'm sorry about that. But let's start talking just a little bit about, no, actually, let's do just a little bit more conduction. Let's do a simple thing where I'm going to tell you to make a loop. So all that means is that you do something repetitive. And I'm just going to have these folks here from the left, right about here. And don't do it until I cue it. Now, there you go. Now, I'm going to pick on you because I know you. Make a loop. Now, I'm going to tell you to imitate that. Now I'm going to tell you to speed it up. Everyone. You just stay right there. Right? Okay. This to me, now it's funny, and I was going to talk about this later, but now that happened, I'm going to talk about it now. One thing that when Steph Richards, who's a great trumpet player, also does a lot of conduction, and Brandon came out, was that I realized that everybody, of course, has their own approach, which is great, no problem. And I realized, but it taught me a little bit something about my approach, which is that I think I almost use it more as a composing, arranging tool, whereas I think they use it and other people use it more as an extension of themselves as an improviser, as a player. In other words, I can play this band, as opposed to, I really like the arrangement side. In this project that I'm going to do tomorrow night called Electric Circus, I can take little riffs from soul tunes and funk tunes and stuff. And so I can have 3 different songs going on at the same time, and I can also have, you know, someone take a solo for 2 bars and then not take a solo for 2 bars. So a lot of times it's like I'm at a mixing board, okay? Butch did this a little bit at the beginning, we'll get into that, and he was starting to get interested in that at the end, in the sense that he used written material. But the main thing is that, let's do those loops again. When I go like this, it's because I want it to happen in a certain place. Okay, great. So let's talk about Butch a little bit, just historically. So Butch was born in LA. I've got some nice pictures that my friend Don Heffington sent me. Don was a drummer who went on later to do a lot of kind of pop things in LA, but he knew Butch as a young man. And this is a picture of Butch right when he joined the Army, I believe. Let me see if I can do this. And he sent this to me, which is, I think, just a beautiful photo. And then, this blows my mind. Oh, man, that's amazing. And that's, Don's the white guy. And he is a great drummer, went on to play with Emmylou Harris and do a lot of pop stuff and do singer-songwriter stuff. But at this point, he was playing, basically, I think they were playing sort of post-bop, and also, you know, Ornette was doing stuff at the time, etc. So obviously this is Butch with Ornette. And then this is a picture, I believe, oops, sorry. Well, we'll get into this a little later, but this is me and Butch at the kitchen when we were both much younger, etc. So Butch was in LA. He was obviously in that scene. I mean, do people here know who John Carter, clarinetist, Bobby Bradford, you know, that's sort of the generation just after Ornette Coleman in Los Angeles, and David Murray. And Butch came to New York around the same time as David did, and David started to really see his star rise in the, you know, when was that? Late 70s, early 80s, a lot of stuff in the Village Voice about David, et cetera, et cetera. And he put together a large ensemble, and Butch was playing cornet. And so then Butch started to do some conduction with David. And the important thing about that is that he was, I don't even really know, I saw that band once or twice, but I think he was still playing cornet, but he was also doing conduction. But the conduction was like I was just talking about. It had to do with kind of arranging the music. I mean, he was, and I actually don't know how Butch did it. I mean, I don't mean like how he was capable to do it. I mean how he did it structurally. I'm not sure he did what I do, which I'll show you a little bit later, which is to take a few measures and put numbers to them and stuff. But he was able to basically do sort of a live rearranging of the music with David's music, and it was very much coming out of the scores of what was essentially, I don't know, what was David's band like? I mean, it was like 12 people or something. It wasn't like a full big band, but as I recall, you know, it's 6, 7 horns, bass, drums, piano, stuff like that. So Butch got into that. At the same time, he was playing a lot of cornet. And I think that one of the things that's unfortunate is that, I shouldn't say unfortunate, but I think that Butch's legacy is in this thing of that he's sort of known now as the conduction guy. And he was an unbelievable cornet player and so beautiful. And what I'm going to do is we're going to listen to just a little bit of music for a few minutes. And I want to show sort of the sort of breadth of what he did. And again, this is very Wayne Horvitz centric. I apologize. But this is a trio with J.A. Dean. Do people here know who that is? So, so Dino became, I mean, you know, he was with Butch always, forever. When I moved to Seattle, I didn't lose, I mean, we stayed in touch, but it wasn't, you know, he just did stuff with Butch for the entire last, you know, 30, 35 years of his life. And this is a trio that Butch had with myself and Dino, and he really got interested in doing things because we were using things like looping pedals and stuff, which was not really, I mean, I don't know, how many of you play music in this room? And how many of you, how many of you use looping pedals? Yeah, I mean, you know, it's ubiquitous, right? It was not at the time, and it was a very unusual thing. In fact, before I go on and play this, I did want to, I've talked just a little bit about some of his community, which also was very much involved with David Murray, as I mentioned, but Frank Lowe, Helly Bang, just all sorts of people from that scene. I got to play in an early ensemble of his where Jimmy Lyons, who was in the Cecil Taylor band, played. And it was really interesting with Butch. When I first moved here, I moved here just weeks after Frank Lowe had made a really interesting record called Lo and Behold. And Lo and Behold is a pretty obscure record. And what's interesting about it is that it's Philip Wilson, I believe, on drums. I may have that wrong. William Parker may be on it, Frank Lowe is on it, Billy is on it, Frank is on it. All people who came from essentially a kind of a post-Chicago, post-St. Louis, African-American, what, for lack of a much better word, free jazz kind of scene. And then he asked Polly Bradfield, who very few of you probably know who that is, and John Zorn, who all of you know who that is, and Eugene Chapman, who a good deal of you know who this, to be on the record. And with Butch, and Butch didn't do any conduction, Butch just played, but this was just a really interesting reaching out to this kind of young scene that came more from contemporary music and rock music in some ways. Maybe less so with John and Polly, but certainly with Eugene and certainly a lot of us and that came along later. And to me, that record's incredibly underrepresented as the first sort of instance of these two sorts of parts of the sort of post-Cecil Taylor, post-Ornette, post-John Coltrane scene blending with this thing that was later called the downtown music scene. And I think Frank Lowe, who, if anyone knew him, I was talking to Marty Ehrlich about him earlier today, we all missed tremendously, and he was sort of, played with Alice Coltrane, et cetera, et cetera. But so, Butch really took up that baton and started to reach out to all sorts of people. So this picture that I was showing when you first came in was with myself and Christian Marclay. And that was a really interesting thing. I mean, listen, William Parker's a great friend and Billy Bang was the first person to take me on tour, et cetera, et cetera. But they were not asking Christian Marclay to play turntables while they played their instrument. It was just kind of a stretch that Butch really reached out to this other community. And he really got interested in the scene. There was people like myself, like Dino, like Bill Frisell, who were using looping pedals. You know, we weren't like blowing anyone's minds, but it wasn't as ubiquitous as it is now. So this is a very short thing that Dino sent me a few years back that's, excuse me, that was this trio. There we go. And this is Butch on cornet. So that was, his trio was always completely improvised. And then I put together a band with Bobby Previn and Butch where I wrote some tunes, and also we did some stuff where Bobby and I particularly played with drum machines and synthesizers. And this is one of the more open pieces. There were some more composed pieces, but I'll play you just a little moment of this. But it sort of blows my mind what a really beautiful cornet player he was. And I also think that Butch had this really gorgeous harmonic sensibility that was really mixed in with this incredible sonic sensibility, all from his horn. You know, I had pianos and synthesizers, and he's just get this stuff. And that piece, although it sounds pretty open, was actually always the same. I mean, we had a couple of preset drum patterns, and we had these certain chords, and there was no actual head to it, but some of our other tunes were more traditional. So this is something which was when Butch was still doing conduction, but still writing music. And I'll show you the score in just a second, but here is this piece, and it's from a record called Dust to Dust. And actually, I'd like to talk about that for just a second, just to talk about the community. I already mentioned Christian. I was thinking about that. He reached out to so many different people, to Brandon Ross, to Wilbur Morris, his brother, Carol Emanuel, who was a harp player, who worked with Alva Rogers, who was a great singer. And then in this band, you have Hecky Bodner on French horn, John Paul Borelli on guitar, Brian Carrot on vibraphone, Andrew Cyril on drums, J.A. Dean, drum and electronics, Marty Ehrlich on clarinet, Janice Grice on bassoon, myself on keyboard electronics, Jason Huang on violin, Myra Melford on piano, Zena Parkins on harp, John Purcell on oboe. And Butch is only listed on the new world record as the conductor, which is funny because he actually plays a lot of cornet. And I was surprised because I revisited this record recently because I actually transcribed some of it and had a performance in Seattle. And I was really surprised how much cornet he played on it, because I thought of this period as being the beginning where he sort of stopped playing cornet. But you can see what I mean about his very romantic and melodic sensibility. I'm going to just go and fast forward a little bit. Sorry, give me 1 sec. So basically, he had a series after that beautiful theme at the beginning. He had this sort of series of chord progressions where he just told, Zena and Brian, who was playing vibes, the drums, Myra on piano, particularly to just sort of follow these and keep sort of a steady rhythm thing. And Jean-Paul Borelli, I don't know if people know of him. I haven't actually seen his name for a while, but he was just always sort of, killing it on top of it. And just to show you quickly what that looks like. Well, this was the score. He had a couple of scores, but you can see where it shows, you can see this melody, and then when you see letter I, or I guess that's a 1, I'm not sure, yeah, it's a 1. You see those half notes there, and these were just these chords, and then he just told the rhythm people to play over that. And by the end, we don't really have time to check out the whole thing, but you should go listen to it. It's on New World, and I think it was in the early 90s or maybe late 80s. And at the end, it just falls apart, and it just gets more and more, it just keeps going and going and going. And all these pieces on that record are great. I actually produced that record, and it was for New World, and I'll never forget going over to his house to check out the rough mixes, because we were going to talk about starting to mix and what we wanted to do, and we were going to check. And he lived on 7th Street, actually across the street from where I had lived, and I wasn't living very far away at that point. And then I went over there, and he had 2 speakers. One speaker was here, and one speaker was here. And I was like, hey, Butch, could we move the right speaker here and the left? It's like, no, this is the way I like to listen to music. When we got into the studio to mix, he didn't make the engineer take one speaker and put it on the other, but in any event. And then this is from the same record, but I think you'll note that it's fairly, I don't really remember if there was any written music to this. It's called the Bartok Improvisation. So the question is, and I really don't recall, is whether the thing that you hear Myra and Zena do at the beginning was something that just happened and then he decided to loop it like we did earlier, or if it was something that came from a little bit of source material. I don't remember. So you can hear a lot of the things that came about. I mean, I'm starting to hear some things that he would do. Obviously, you hear things where he's looping. You can hear the things where he's using long tones. But he also is very much involved in, and when Steph Richards, who some of you may know who that is, and Brandon Ross came out to Seattle, they did some conductions too, and I really realized how I had gotten into my sort of arranging composer sensibility, like I would, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but using riffs and doing certain things and trying to bring things in and out the way a composer or arranger would, or even someone who's in the studio is trying to mix something. So for example, in this thing, Electric Circus, tomorrow night, I might have a James Brown riff and a Los Lobos riff and a Sly and the Family Stone riff and a Sun Ra riff all going at once, and I might make permutations with that, and I might do a thing where I have the guitar player solo for 4 bars and the other guitar player solo for 4 bars, and those are more like the kinds of things you do when you mix and you arrange, but it's live. And what's great about it is people screw up a lot and it gets really interesting. But more so than when you're working in Pro Tools. But that being said, both Brandon and Steph got really into a whole nother thing that Butch did, which was to go, like for example, you just make noise when I point to you, okay? Yeah. And then he would do gestures like he'd go, and people would go, and you can hear that. I've actually not pursued that myself because I don't know, I just got other ideas. But it is something that he was very effective with. And I just want to take a moment to go back to sort of what conduction is and where it comes from. And it reminded me that when I was at UC Santa Cruz, I took a class with an ethnomusicology teacher, and he taught one class that was for non-musicians. And in that class, he spent almost the entire time talking about structure, gesture, volume, density, instrumentation, all things that you don't need to be a musician to understand. And when you think about people going to the symphony, and you think about probably 90, there just aren't that many people, or going to see a jazz concert and going, oh, the way he used the flat 13th on that chord. I mean, I'm sorry, most people listening aren't looking at it that way. And with the symphony and the orchestra, I think it's really true. And sorry, I digress, but it reminds me of my mother. She really didn't care for jazz, and she liked classical music, but she would come to hear these very open improvised concerts, particularly if they weren't too aggressive and too just like out, but more, I don't know, more sort of stuff that I certainly was involved in. Dave here and I had a place called Studio Henry in the West Village years ago, and my mother would come to that, and she'd go, you know, I like that. And I mean, she was saying it as if I'm surprised I like it, but I like that. And I think the reason she liked that more than hearing, you know, my dad play a Duke Ellington, or particularly a Charlie Parker record, would probably be the best example, because at least with Duke Ellington, I don't mean at least with Duke Ellington, nothing about Charlie Parker. It was obviously, you know, a great hero of the 20th century. But I think my mother was attracted to those things that were about gesture and dynamics and excitement, and, you know, the timpani comes in here, or the brass section comes in here. And so my teacher, David, would do this class, and the whole semester would be about that stuff. And the test would be, you know, what happened in this music? And it wasn't about going from the one chord to the four chord. It was about what happened in the structure. And a lot of people respond to that. And so when you think about this stuff, it's dealing mostly with that. All of you get to kind of play whatever you want. Now in my music, not so much, because I also have these motifs I use, but when Butch was doing what I call pure conduction, which means that there's no written material involvement, he's dealing only with those aspects of the music, but he's working with improvisers that have, you know, a lot of language and a lot of content. And there's also, you know, as you'll see in a minute, because I'm going to play a little clip of Butch talking about this, but you know, I'm sure a lot of you know about Walter Thompson, who did something called sound painting at the same time, and that's still around. Zorn's game pieces were a great example of this stuff. And for me as an improviser, if doing Butch's, I didn't work with Walter, but doing Butch's stuff and doing Zorn's game pieces was so important for me in terms of having an evolution as an improviser, to just stop thinking, oh, we're just gonna all play and go, which there was this, I shouldn't say this, but there was a certain amount of that at the time, but just so many things could happen. You know, there was the possibility for something to be completely crazy, and then suddenly everyone to be very quiet and to be very tonal, you know, and that was exciting to me. I heard that a lot in what was coming out of Chicago, particularly with the Art Ensemble of Chicago. I felt that there was a, you know, Cecil Taylor was an absolute hero to me, but the Art Ensemble came along and I was like, oh my God, there's this beautiful song in the middle of this other thing, and that really appealed to me personally, because to be perfectly frank, you know, I've always liked songs. And Butch always liked songs. I mean, Butch was, my wife, Robin Holcomb, is, in my estimation, a great songwriter, and Butch just adored her music. And that meant a lot to both of us. And later, when he, just before he got sick, he decided to go back to using some written material, just like he had done in the early days. And this recording you just heard may have been the last instance of that for many, many years. And he wrote both of us and asked us if he could use some written music we had done in this thing he was going to do in Italy for a year. And then he got sick and passed, which was extremely unfortunate. But I was very touched and flattered that he thought of us. So this is a lecture that was sponsored by SF Jazz, and so let me get this, that's not what we want. Here we are. And I think it's worth, I think it's hilarious and informative, and we'll look at the first few minutes.
I started to study conducting, traditional conducting.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. 1 second. This should work. There we go.
I started to study conducting, traditional conducting. And it was probably when my conducting teachers couldn't answer my questions that I discovered that I had to kind of go my own way with this. I started developing a vocabulary of signs and gestures to indicate certain things that don't exist in traditional conducting and that don't exist in improvisation necessarily. But then also I'd
like to stop there because the point about that don't exist in conducting is almost obvious, right? But he just so quickly says that don't exist in improvisation either necessarily. And I think that's really important because I think that Butch has been gone for over 10 years and I feel reluctant to put words into his mouth, but I know we had a lot of conversations and I felt the same way, and I was always, not struggling, but I was always sort of trying to explore sort of how to make things really feel like they had structural integrity, and also that the possibility for sort of harmonic language and certain kinds of rhythmic language that I felt frustrated sometimes when I was doing completely improvised music, even though I was so excited about what was happening at the same time. And I know he felt that way. And I think, without getting too into it, I will say that it was really funny working with Butch in the early days when he was working with many of his best friends, including Frank Lowe, his brother Wilbur, Helly Bang, and he would tell them to play and they would just go, because that was where they were coming from. And he would treat them almost shabbily. He'd say like, Frank, and he'd just be, he wanted to have everybody sort of contributing to an entire ensemble music. He was looking for an ensemble music. He was looking to be able to use conduction to make something that he couldn't achieve with pencil and paper, but that sounded like sort of compositional. Now that's me saying that. A lot of people might not agree, but we had a lot of conversations, and I feel like, he listened to all sorts of music, and he wanted to make those things, happen. It was funny to watch that stuff happen. And everyone loved each other and it was all good, but there was definitely a thing. But then when I saw him work later with like classical ensembles in Europe, particularly younger classical ensembles, and they all said, we're not improvisers. And he just went to town with people like that. I don't mean he laid into them. He just said, that's fine, you don't need to be an improviser. Give me a long tone, repeat a phrase. And those musicians were interesting. Now, it wouldn't always work. You could be in a group of more conservative classical musicians. For example, I know from experience that probably wouldn't work with the Seattle Symphony, even today. But in Europe, I shouldn't have said that, but in Europe, with young ensembles who were playing a lot of, they were playing so much more contemporary music. I mean, that's just a fact. The European ensembles are playing, not only are they playing Stravinsky and Bartok, but they're playing Stockhausen, they're playing Ligeti, etc. So they had a lot of what we might call extended technique language. So they were always really familiar with that. Man, when he went to town with them, it was unbelievable. I mean, that was, to me, some of the most exciting music. Because none of them were, quote, improvisers, and they were all improvising, And yet they all had spent their entire life trying to make ensembles sound good. So they really knew how to play together. I mean, I would have loved to have heard him work with the Count Basie band too, because that was a band that spent a lot of time trying to just make, an ensemble sound incredible. So I think that's an important point, and he just sort of says that quickly, but I wanted to stop there and make that point.
Covered that this whole idea dates back to the 1500s or before, and that Frank Zappa's done it, Charles Moffat's done it, actually one of the people I studied with here in the East Bay. Leonard Bernstein did it in the 60s. He actually has a recording out of print called Four Improvisations for Orchestra. Alan Silva, a Senegalese named Doudou and Daye Rose. These are some of the people, of course, Lucas Foss. And it goes on. And I started to discover what their contribution to this idea was. But there was one thing that they did that I did not want. I did not want to limit my ideas to style, and I didn't want to limit my ideas to stylistic category. I wanted to work with musicians who wanted to explore the unknown. And so since then, I use a lot of traditional instruments from different countries with Western instruments, with electronics, and so on and so forth. Of course, when you do it within one community, that community tells you what it wants to do. I was studying at Old Merritt College, and my conducting, I'd say, well, what can I do? If I wanted the orchestra to go back to rehearsal number 1, how do I do that? And she said, why would you?
I'm sorry, that's just so beautiful, just hilarious. I can just see her face when he says that, you know, we're on bar 167 and I want to go back to bar 22. How do I do that? You know, and anyway, he goes on.
Do that. And I said, well, if I wanted the orchestra to do this, she said, well, if the composer would have wanted that, the composer would have written that. I said, well, what if I'm the composer and the conductor? She said, why would you want to do that? But then I would go see Charles Moffat, and he said, oh man, you do it like that. Or you go like that. You go like that. He said, if you think about it, notation is a great idea. But somebody and some people had great ideas. And that's why there's such a thing as notation. You have to put all ideas together. I show musicians how to interpret symbolism. What they do with it is up to them. But basically, they are embellishing this information when I go like that, or elaborating on it, or varying, or inverting it. I mean, they're not improvising a development. They're taking something very specific and they're developing it. You with me? You with me? Please, I want to know that I'm going to take you on this journey. When I say develop this idea, I'm not interested in a free improvisation because that's not what this means. This means to develop something very specific. When I go like this, okay, don't play. This means to yield, by the way. It just means to pay attention. I'm going to give you some information. That's the information. Come on, ready? Ready? I'll tell you when. That's the information. That's it. That's the information. So when
Anyway, that's great. I love the idea in the conducting class. And of course, it's interesting because, I mean, one of the things that you have to start to think about is that, you know, it's called conduction. It really doesn't have much to do with conducting. I mean, it really is a very different thing, except that you're up front and people have to pay attention to you. In fact, one of the interesting things to me is that, you know, if anyone's been in classical ensemble or followed a conductor, you know, you're basically 90% of the score and 10% on the conductor. I mean, the conductor, and it's sort of peripheral. With conduction, you really have to pay attention. You know, one of the really interesting things for me, and it goes back to Butch talking about improvising, is this means to solo, whereas this means to play, and to play means not to solo. But I say to people, if I say solo, I mean that in the egotistical, you're the featured person soloist. Now, it doesn't mean I can't tell everybody in the band to solo. They can, but at the same time, if I tell, you know, you to solo, and then I tell everyone else to play, you're supposed to be thinking, you know, compositionally, structurally, musically, to be sort of accompanying that. And that's something that, you know, was something, you know, he was really adamant about. I never actually give people information the way he did, like do this rhythm or something like that, or that kind of gestural thing. And as I said, I think that comes more out of, for me, I think of it more as a sort of semi-compositional tool. But in any event, I did want to talk just a little bit about how I got back into it. I wasn't into it for a long time. I don't mean I was against it. I just mean I was doing other things, you know. And so when I left New York I moved to Seattle in 1989. I stopped being involved in it because I wasn't living here and Butch was doing it. And then of course now you meet just all sorts of people who do conduction, but it just wasn't as common. And so it wasn't until, like I said, 20 years later when he came out to Seattle that I put these ensembles together. I was in the ensemble. And then I was teaching with John Hollenbeck. I was teaching a summer workshop for high school kids, and these kids were like really, really good musicians, and they were all jazz, you know. So I wanted to get them to do some more open improvisation without chord changes or out of time, and I was just having no luck whatsoever. And I started to use conduction because sometimes when you do conduction, it just gets exciting. As I wrote something recently, I said, you know, I mean, the funny thing about conduction is that if you have a whole group of people who are really beginning musicians and you're trying to get them to do something that involves improvisation, it's really difficult. And if you have 6-year-olds or 8-year-olds, they always have a really strong feeling about what's right and what's wrong, and they want to play something right. But if you tell a whole group, actually, my friend Sarah Schimbeck and I were just in a high school in Eastern Virginia that was kind of almost at the edge of Appalachia, and there were 500 kids. And I said to this group, you know, sing a song. And then I said, I want you guys to do something completely different. And I was amazed. I mean, they went for it. But I didn't have that sense. Now I have the confidence to do that. But this time I was dealing with these kids. They were all very smart, very jazz literate, and they just didn't want to do something that wasn't about time and about their chops and et cetera. So I brought a tune of mine in. In fact, it may have been this tune that I was going to play for you. I'm not sure. But I'd also brought some charts in, and some of them were sort of, you know, a little more open. And they played it, and then I said, I tell you what, I want you to take a pencil, and I want you to put the number 1 over the first 2 bars, and the number 2 over the second 2 bars, and the number 3 over the next 2 bars, et cetera, until I had 6, 7, 8 numbers. And then I started going, okay, you know, the rhythm section would be going, the drums would be going. So now they were happy because it was in time and there was a tonality and there was some sense of chord changes, and they felt like they could show their stuff. And then I said, you play riff number 1, but you play riff number 3, and you play riff number 2. And you know, it was kind of a bluesy tune, and there was some things to it, so that it sort of worked together. And I'm thinking, well, wow, you know, this isn't that much different than what Mingus did. I mean, you know, Mingus wouldn't bring the music out; he would make people learn it. Though the story is that John Haney then waited outside, and the guys all paid him $5 to write down their parts. But I'm not sure if that's true. But in any event, then they were sort of buying it. And we did that for a couple of days, and I thought, okay, I'm going to put together a band like this with my own musicians in Seattle. So I started something called the Royal Room Collective Music Ensemble. The Royal Room's a club that until about 6 weeks ago, I was actually one of the owners. And it left, and so it's still there, it's doing great, but I just got out after about 14 years. But we played every Monday night. And I would do mostly my tunes, but I do tunes of, I do some Monk tunes and some Herbie Nichols tunes, and I did the same thing with the Monk tunes. I mean, how many people know the tune Epistrophe? You know, so you've got da da da, and you're da da da, and then the bridge is da da da, you know, or da 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 da. So you know, and I've got just great players. So I've got 5 woodwinds and 3 trumpets and 3 trumpets, bass drums and piano. I just conduct. And you know, I can do the same thing with the Monk tune. And I mean, Epistrophe is like, I mean, it's just bored to treat this way, you know, because it is essentially these sort of modular motifs that all can fit together. And so, you know, I guess I want to go back to something that I was trying to say at the very beginning, which I don't really think of this. I run into people who I feel like they're trying to present conduction as like this radical departure. I really don't feel that it's that way at all. I think it's a very common sense way to put music together. You know, it's just as common sense as lots of other ways we approach music. If we can take, you know, a beat with an 808 drum machine and put a sample from blah 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 and do this, and then why can't we take live musicians and do this? I don't think any of it is, you know, greater or less radical. Let me think where I want to do with this. So I will show you quickly, and then we'll we'll have questions in just a minute if there are any. I'm going to show you just quickly. Oh, let's do this. We'll have a couple of nice other pictures. I'm just fond of this picture. And speaking of, for those of you who knew J.A. Dean, this is Dino with the trombone. I'm at the piano, Butch, and a German guy named Kalle Lahr in Munich. But did any of you know Dino? Or I mean, just, you know, we miss him so much. And actually, I just was in Bologna, and Dino and Steph Richards, who I mentioned earlier, was quite a bit younger, were supposed to do a duo sort of for Butch, and then Dino passed, and I did it with her, and it was really wonderful. The other thing really exciting to me, which will mean nothing to the rest of you about Steph, is that she just moved to Seattle. So I'm very thrilled because we now have a little posse of people who had worked with Butch. And then finally, I'm just going to open this. This is a picture with Bobby Previtt and myself, our promo picture for the Horvitz Morris Previtt trio. That was a trio that I'm sort of one of my proudest moments, and some of the pieces are much more so than the one I played. I would say, you know, very much like songs. And then we did a record of my wife Robin Holcomb's music. It's also a really lovely record, and Bill Frisell and Doug Wiseman also play on that record. And so in any event, I'm going to show you. Well, I forgot to bring the score to the piece I'm about to play, but I am going to show you this score because it just gives you some idea of what I do and what I'll be doing tomorrow night. I'm actually going to do two things tomorrow night. I'm going to do stuff that has to do with the Royal Room Collective Music Ensemble, which is like tunes of mine, but then I have some conduction. This is from Electric Circus, so you can see that there's these motifs here. So with Electric Circus, I have something called pods, and a pod is one piece. And there are 10 motifs in the piece, and there's very simple reason why there's 10 motifs. Because I can go 1, 2, 3, 4, and when I get to 10, I had some in the early days that were like 12, and people would it was just a mess. So it's very easy. I have 10, and they come from, you know, this is A Fire in the Bayou. It's a Neville Brothers. The Spanish key is from Miles. Obviously, Sly Stone. There is a Los Lobos lick in there. There's a Captain Beefheart lick in there, et cetera, et cetera. So when I start the pieces, what I do is I might just go like this. Let's do that again. And then when I do, you can change pitch, you can keep the same pitch. And then I might turn to Kenny Wallace and Tony Shearer, who'll be there tomorrow night, and I'll say 1, and I'll go 2, and they'll start playing that Neville Brothers tune. It doesn't mean that everyone's going to play that. So my rule about the structure to this is that I tell them that we're going to play Pod 9, and I could start the piece and we could never use a single motif from the tune. Or we could play one tune for a half hour, or we could play all 10 tunes all at the same time. And sometimes that happens, not all 10, but sometimes 4 or 5 runs, et cetera, et cetera. It isn't necessarily, and certainly I've done like sometimes these sets will last an hour. I've certainly done them where I thought, oh wow, we went a whole hour and I never did like 6 or 10, you know, it doesn't matter. I'm improvising as much as anybody else. I get up and I get there and I have this in front of me. When we're done, we're done. Like tomorrow night, we're going to do some other tunes of mine without the electric bass, without the electric guitars, without the singer, without the percussionists, that are more like my project, the Royal Community Creative Music Ensemble, Collective Music Ensemble. And then we're going to do 2 of these. And that'll include the guitars. And it's 2 basses, 2 guitars, keyboards, percussion, drums. It's almost like an Afro-pop band. I mean, actually, Will, it reminds me of a smaller version of Peter's band in a way, you know, just in terms of the instrumentation. And that was certainly an inspiration for me when I put it together. Peter Affelbaum, who Will played with, and had an incredible band, or still has incredible bands. But so anyway, so that's what those scores look at. But it can be, you know, it can really feel like a sort of groove band for most of the set, or it can hardly ever feel like that way. because it's conduction. And I think that's the important thing to remember about what Butch got up and did. You know, when Butch did stuff with what I call, you know, pure conduction with no written material, it's not like he got up there and had a plan. I mean, it's just another extension of doing a free improvisation event where you are just a conductor, whereas you're the musician and you're the musician and you're the musician. So this is a much more, well, I'll show you just a moment of, and we should stop in a second. I'm going to play you two things. Do we have just a few more minutes before questions? Is that okay? Okay. I'll go about 5 more minutes and then we'll do the questions. So this is a much more, in fact, I think this is the tune that I worked with these kids on. Listening back to this is about a decade old. I realized, you know, it's really tempting to have this material to just cue all sorts of stuff in there. And it was a simple reason I didn't, because Naomi was killing it. You know, I didn't need to. I mean, I just wanted those few things. And just for the sake of... I've got a couple of people soloing, and then other motifs. So in this, this is another piece from the same band, and this is just all written. Let me do this another way. Let me just open this up so I can. This is almost the opposite in that there we go. This is just play the theme, and then this is a pure conduction in the middle. But you can hear the loops almost immediately. actually, I take that back because eventually, we don't have much time, but I will start to conduct just this one set of chords while everything else is free. So you can take that thing where, it's really about all the written material and you're moving it, or you can just have that thing where, everything's really very improvised. And then I will play this, and then we'll take some and then that disappeared, and a few of us here, our friend Scarrick, and so, and he's soloing, but then I grab a loop, and then everyone's in, and then I do this, which is this sort of, and so, and it continues to get farther and farther away, and more, I don't know, like some sort of odd version of modern weird music. It was perfect. My 1 hour timer just went off. Any questions?
Hello, Wayne. I'm Richie. I'm a turntable player, turntablist, also aspirations for conduction. But how many hand gestures would you use in your ensemble usually? I know like there's a list of...
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good question. Like tomorrow night, because at least half the musicians I would say well over half the musicians I've never done conduction with. About half the musicians I've never worked with, or maybe a little less than that, but something like that. So I usually start with the things that I know will work, and if I've worked with a band a long time, I know that Walter Thompson has this endless hand gestures from what I gather, and I really have sort of 10 to 15 that are sort of fundamental, and then another 6 or 8 that I throw in depending on people. And I have things that depends on the project. For example, now that I'm doing things that are more sort of either in the more, I would say, jazz adjacent stuff that you heard first, and then the more electric stuff, I have things that are maybe a little bit more rhythmic and a little, the sort of obvious, like walking bass. I have something called pedal point, which just means that if I turn to the bass player and I go like this, they know they're going to do a pedal point, and then I give, and then boom, 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 and then I go up in pitch or down in pitch. One thing I do that I don't think Butch did, and I don't think that like some other people I know, and I actually did it here. If I could show it to you again, but we'll go on time. I told the bass players to play lick number 2 and then to play lick number 4 over and over again. And then I said loop that, so they're looping the intention of my conduction. So for example, sometimes I have a band going, I tell this guitar player to solo for 4 bars. And then I'll tell them to stop, and this guitar player to solo for 4 bars. But I don't want to spend the next 5 minutes telling them to do that. So after I've gotten that going a couple times, at least 3 or 4 times, so the redundancy conveys what's going on, then I go, loop the idea of my conduction. They don't have to loop what they were playing. When I tell you to loop what you're playing, you're actually, like one of the things I do is like, you know, you're soloing, and you're da-da-da-da-da, and I go like this, I want you, it's like you were soloing, then you kick your loop pedal. And this is different, it's loop, the idea of the conduction. So if I had everybody go like this, let's do the long tones. And then at this point, I go, and then you keep doing it, and I can do something else, right? Which frees me, because I only have 2 hands, and so it frees me to do something else. You did much better than Tony Shear did with that. I just want to say that. I had to show him that many times. So anyway, but I think, I don't know, particularly with all the, and by the way, you know, the one hand signal I may not have made perfectly clear, which is 2 or 4, and that's just to go to the motif on the page, and that's true. So between that and the basic stuff, I probably use less than a lot of people. And I don't do the sort of gestural thing. There's a thing of going across the room. There is something called memory, which is very useful, and people may be familiar with that. And that can be great. That's really useful in the more open stuff. Anyway, but, and speaking of people being, you know, conduction oriented, I mean, wow, I'm just meeting so many people, particularly, you know, people in their 20s and 30s, just, you know, it's like, it's now become a language that's sort of like being able to go into any place in the world and find people who can play changes, or people who can play you know, and that's great. I think it's fantastic.
At that point, I just wanted to enlarge the scope a bit. That's Long Goodbye, which also used that production of Othello at the Shakespeare Theater in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And the other thing about Butch, my name is Alan Graubart. I worked for Butch for 30 plus years. I was one of his major writers. We wrote an opera together, Modette, which was one of the last pieces he played in Italy. Butch was open to an extraordinary array of creative people on the Lower East Side and internationally. I'm talking about sculptors, different writers, and academics as well. That was what was astonishing to me as a writer about him. And he also was using something, the Chorus of Poets, which I wrote for as a writer, to find those words used as conduction notes. Quite astonishing to hear language broken up, reassembled, and thrown out into the universe like that. Quite amazing. Yeah. Butch Morris was really an exceptional guy, as you know very well, because you met him in the late 70s. Yeah. I met him in the middle 70s in San Francisco and Oakland. And we worked together from then on as a jazz cornetist, and then he, as he mentioned to me, he graduated to be a conductor. And he also had this wonderful phrase, as notation is symbolic of music, conduction is symbolic of notation.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And that's his definition of conduction.
Yeah, that's great.
One other thing I want to mention, there are 2 books. One, several of us wrote with Butch, which has an explication of his philosophy and also all the conduction gestures he developed. Right. The Art of Conduction, Conduction Workbook. You can probably find a copy in a library. It's pretty much out of print.
Pretty much out of print. Actually, I almost brought it tonight because Marty has a copy.
And Dino wrote a very beautiful, precise, small book which captures everything.
No, that's absolutely right.
J-A-D. But thanks for being here
Well, and
for
I've
Butch.
talked to, I forget her name, in Italy, who helped Butch so much with it. I'm just spacing out, but you know who I mean. And,
Yeah.
And she, you know, we keep talking about when that book can be a PDF and available, and I guess it's a little bit of a problem, but hopefully that'll happen.
But it's at the you can get it at NYU Library if you want to look at it.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks a lot.
Sure.
Anyone else, question-wise?
Should I use the microphone or not?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm getting my exercise.
Hey there, Lisa Perrott, musician. The Butch Morris composition, the Bartok comprovisation, that's actually a little hard to say, I have to say,
Yeah.
comprovisation. From what you're describing about your approach to conduction, do you sort of feel like that's how you sort of more approach conduction, like comprovisation, like you've got composed parts and you're improvising with the composed parts?
Well, okay, I was just talking to John Raskin about this, who's in the Robo-Saxophone Quartet, and I hadn't seen him for years. Somehow we started talking about this, and he said, where did that term comprovisation come from? And I'd forgotten all about it. And I guess it was sort of something we were all, you know, sort of playing with in the 80s, just like, how do you talk about this? Because there's the whole thing about, I don't know, I think all of this stuff is sort of overwrought sometimes, but that's just me. It's like, you know, is improvisation composition? And it just seems to be almost a moot discussion. I mean, you know, why do we, of course it is, and of course it's not the same as taking out a pencil, and of course it's, you know, it's just like, it's just making music. Your question specifically to me, like when I'm actually using, no, I think I get the question, is when I'm actually using motifs that are written, sure, but I don't think it's any more so than Butch just starting with a completely improvised palette. And, you know, so I hadn't looked at it that way. And I was surprised to see that this piece was called that, because I hadn't thought about that in a long time. But I was really intrigued that Butch had decided to go back to using some written material that he wanted to play with that, and then, God, I wish I had gotten to do that.
I do have some of the orchestral stuff because I did copying for Butch.
Right.
Right. And I think it was the stuff he was doing with an orchestra in Italy.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so.
It was just, he was gonna have a whole year residency.
Yeah, so I did get to know him and work with him doing that sort of stuff right before he passed away.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's
Yeah.
nice. Yeah.
Anyway.
So do you have some of that? I would love to see it. Yeah, thank you.
I don't throw anything away.
Yeah. that would be amazing. Anyone else? Back there.
Hi. I was just gonna ask you about Miles' approach, because he, as I know, was doing that in the late '60s and early '70s when he introduced to electric instruments,
Yeah.
and he was giving cues to his players, I guess, in a pretty loose way, probably, and there was a lot more about his energy, I guess, and he was like maybe giving like a couple of chords, right? And then mostly it was just happening, I guess, as like his concert recordings that came up later. I was just gonna ask you about him, and does it
No, that's
have
great.
any
I mean,
similarities?
Absolutely, and you know, and of course, you know, there was also, I mean, all of this stuff is also connected. I mean, Teo Macero obviously did all this editing too, and so what's the difference? I mean, there is no difference. It's just, you know, there's different ways to get to the same thing. Now, when you use different techniques, different things are going to happen. I'm just saying, what's the difference in terms of like a value system? You know, do we value one more than another? And I just have no patience for that. You know, it's all really interesting. If he wants to have people improvise on a groove for a long time and then go splice it up later, that's great. And in some ways, it's just the same. And I think Butch really liked the idea of the live energy, and obviously Miles did too. You know, he went into the studio and got that stuff going. And I think that, you know, I don't know that much about the process of how he cued. Obviously you hear that stuff. I mean, it's funny, for me, I came from rock and roll, and the thing that turned me on to jazz was Live at the Fillmore by Miles Davis. And it took me a few years to go back to, you know, the earlier Miles Davis, or to go back. I mean, my dad had listened to a lot of jazz, so I did have some of that going on. But that, you know, spoke to me directly because it was simple. I was listening to Jimi Hendrix, and I was listening to the Grateful Dead, and I was listening to Sly, and then this stuff was something I could hear immediately. And there's those moments that just go boom. And with Butch, of course, or even with Zorn's Game Pieces, those were cues and those were things. Now, it turns out that some of those were just, you know, splices. But, okay, it sounds great. I mean, you know, what does it matter? Are there any more questions? Because I want to get back to that for just a second, but I'm just curious.
Hi, I have a very different kind of question. I was curious if, how young you have worked with children doing conduction or other people. I'm super interested in improvisation with very young kids before they've reached that age that you mentioned where they start judging and where they're just open to sound as a medium. And I'm just wondering about people's experience with that, if it's been happening, how it works, how it's adapted.
Yeah, I was actually talking to William Parker recently, who I hadn't talked to in a long time, but we had a little Zoom meet about something, and we started talking about that, and that, you know, people are doing it with kids. And it is very timely that you asked me that, because I was in Eastern Virginia, southeastern Virginia, a week ago, and I had never done, this was 500 kids. I was so nervous. I mean, these kids are just, you know, they're not going to buy this. And my friend Sarah Scherneck was with me, and she noticed one thing that I hadn't, which is that I asked for a volunteer, and this one girl who was 5, and she started to sing, "Row, row, row your boat." But she said, "Row, row, row, row." And it would have been so cool, but of course her teacher immediately started to help her. And Sarah and I were so disappointed because we could have just gotten this thing going, row, row, and it was still fun. But I think one small point I haven't made is that conduction is generally something that's used with slightly larger ensembles. I mean, I've never used conduction in a trio. What is that band from LA? They have these hand signs that they use, and they're only a quintet, but they cue each other with certain signs. I'll think of it. But any event, so I think there's safety in numbers. That's one thing with, I mean, if I had a group of 7 kids, I would be less inclined than if I had a group of 20 or 30 kids, you know what I mean? And if you have 100 kids, it's great, because there is this kind of thing. But I think it's fantastic. And the other thing is that the funny thing about conduction is that for it to really be good, it has to be at the highest level. But at a very, very beginning level, you are going to have trouble getting a good version of Take the A Train out of people who can barely play. But you can make some interesting music and teach some kids some interesting things with almost no skill set, even with instruments. So I think it's very powerful that way. And I think it's important to not think of it as a way to expose them to avant-garde improvised music. I mean, that's cool too, but it's also an important way to give them the idea of structure. You know, when you hear a symphony, you've got, you know, one of the things that I often say when I'm frustrated with improvisers is like, you know, someone goes, and then someone else goes, someone else goes, I mean, one of the great things about conduction is you can make sure that that doesn't happen. And without being condescending, and I wouldn't do this to my peers, though occasionally I feel like it, but with students, I'll say, you know, if you were writing an orchestra piece and the flute was going da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, you wouldn't have the basses and the cellos and the violins and all go da-da-da-da-da-da. No, you'd have them do something that was contrapuntal, that created structure, that, well, not even just structure, that created accompaniment, that created context. I mean, that's what's, you know, deep about music, is that you can take something and recontextualize it harmonically, you can recontextualize it rhythmically, and that's what's so much fun for this. This is music I grew up with, and I can do that with it. But I think it's a great question, and I would love to see more of that happen. I'm only just recently been, you know, giving that some thought. Anything else? Because if not, I wanted to end with my anecdote about Miles that I heard from a friend, with Billy Hart told a friend of mine that he got a call from Miles to come in and play. And he didn't really know what to expect. So he came in and set up his drums, and Bottle Roy is coming in, and whoever was playing the tambura or something, and then, it was Steve Grossman, people like that. And he's drumming, and then the bass player comes in. And it's all sort of like people just coming in and starting to play. And Miles comes over to him, and I'm not going to do that thing where I try to imitate Miles' voice, but he basically just says, can you play some James Brown? And Billy Hart is going, this is in the 60s too, so Billy Hart's this smoking jazz drummer, and he probably hasn't thought that much about it. And he's trying to think about, trying to think of a James Brown tune, and he starts playing this beat. And people are literally coming in. The engineers are setting up more microphones. The guy in the back is getting things going. And they're starting to get the headphones dialed in. Or actually, I'm not even sure they were using headphones, because I think they were all in one room. And the music's really starting to get good. And Billy Hart's starting to relax. He's like, okay, this is cool, I've got this. He's just playing basically this same thing over and over again, because that's what Miles asked him to do. It starts to get happening, and the engineers, all the assistants are going into the booth, and it looks like they're already rolling tape, and Miles Davis comes over to Billy Hart, and this is 45 minutes later, and Billy's been playing for 45 minutes the same beat, and Miles comes over and says, "That's not it." So thanks so much for coming, and I really appreciate it, and that's it.